Good morning, everyone. My task here is to offer a counter-narrative. It is so easy to sit in the apex of power and have a very different narrative of Africa. Certainly, many of the analysis of Pricewaterhouse, Goldman Sachs, and others provide about this new Africa is that it's from the apex of power. It's a very different, the narratives are definitely defined. Where do these narratives come from? To what end? And who controls them? But you see it into the slums of Kibera, slums of Lagos. It's a different narratives. It's the narratives of revolution, narratives of frustrated young people who completely wasted. All these growth trajectories have simply bypassed them. So one has to look into how do we balance these issues becoming important. We have to situate that in the larger debate that we will talk about. For the last 6 years, I've been managing quite a number of researchers brought together from a number of the emerging countries. And a series of research we have done. Tim Shaw was part of that group when we first did the book on the rise of China and India in Africa. We have just finished another book on Brazil, India, and China's role on Africa's agricultural development. And as you deep down into there, you find a series of contradictions. I love this work, the work I do, because it is so messy. It is so politically contingent. It's so politically uncertain. And we are really grappling in an environment with mega issues, in an environment of turbulence. So contingency, the fact things are contingent, one has to take into account. Certainly, over the last 40 years, as Joe Clark last night mentioned, Africa's external relations have been very much dominated by patterns of aid, trade, investment between Africa and the OECD countries. And this has begun to change. And within the last decade, a major rebalancing has started, certainly a shift eastwards. At the same time, indeed, I think the tipping points has not yet been reached. As a group, all partners, the OECD countries, as Jackie said, still dominate, will remain relevant. But the directions of change is clear for Africa. By 2050, the picture will look very different. But this, of course, depends what Africans themselves do. African states must take proactive role in defining the terms and conditions of engagement with emerging partners to ensure a win-win outcome. This is particularly true in the management of Africa's natural resources for Africa's development. And as I said, the continent of Africa certainly itself is at the epicenter of the global scramble for resources. There's no question about it. While the traditional donors, the traditional partners, and the new partners, basically led by China, are competing fiercely to access Africa's strategic resources, it is also important to state at the outset that African elites are also being willing accomplice to this whole scramble. At the moment, with few exceptions, the scramble for Africa's resources passes through the doorsteps of governing elites. It passes through the State House, where concessions are sold, royalties are collected. Many of the heads of states, again with few exceptions, treat their countries like a duty-free shop. And the welcome signs basically says everything for sale. The governance issues remain a fundamental constraint to us. It is a fundamental issue. We have to look at it and deal with those issues. So companies from emerging economies, particularly in China, have therefore been able to thrive in countries where the legal, regulatory frameworks are weak or non-existent. I call this basically colonialism by invitation, because this is the reality we're facing there. So we therefore stop blaming the Chinese, stop blaming the Indians for our own failings. But that discussion, of course, is for another day. The central point that I want to make, this counter-narrative today, is that we need to critically examine the key vectors of interaction between Africa and the emerging economies. And Africa's effort really to establish more predictable rules and institutional structures for the management and governance of natural resources will inevitably depend on how the continent manages its relation with the emerging economies, who are also the major importer as well as major investors in Africa's mineral and energy sectors. For example, if you take China, 15% of Chinese import come from fields and companies owned by China. It's not only just buying, they're also strategically investing and having resource dominance there. So understanding the nature of this Africa emerging economic relationship and the mechanism through which this asymmetrical relationship is being sustained is as important as crafting laws, regulations, natural resource charters. That is important. We need to understand this mechanism. It's not a matter of laws, regulations. We have them. We discussed about it yesterday. What are the mechanisms? As I said, is trade, investment, and development cooperation, what we call aid. Very sensitive. I'll come back to this issue. In the case of China, there may be a fourth dimension, which is going to be migration. The migration issue is becoming a sensitive issue. The significant number of Chinese beginning to resettle. What is it going to mean in 20, 30 years from now? So what distinguishes the OECD countries from the emerging countries is that the latter take a strategic approach for deepening their relationship with Africa. They respectively bundle their aid and trade and investment in order to achieve strategic objectives, two strategic objectives. The first is have to do securing long-term security of energy and other strategic resources. The second also have to do to have significant proportion of Africa's growing market in goods and services. So this will definitely, I think, they exercise full control in defining the content, the pace, the direction of relationship with Africa. So in a sense, China, Turkey, Korea, India, they all have a policy on Africa. But Africa have no policy on India. Africa has no policy on China. So in terms of the discourse, it's very much dictated by these actors. Let me come back to these three dimensions: the trade dimension, the aid dimension, and the investment dimension. If you take the case of trade, the number of African countries conducting trade with the emerging partners greatly is increasing. This is basically constantly changing. And this figure that you see here shows you where the developed countries and the emerging countries are. There will be a period where there will be the figure is crossing. Increasingly, there's been a decline from the OECD countries, but a corresponding increase from the emerging economies. China's trade grew significantly over the last 10 years. But in the meantime, let's not overemphasize only just China. While China remains a dominant actor in Africa, the combined volume of trade by the other emerging countries is also huge. If you look at it there, basically the emerging countries, plus the 14 emerging countries currently account to 36% of that. Just take only the 4 of them, Brazil, China, India, and Turkey, they account almost 23%. This is changing. So in a sense, increasingly their role is it's not only China, but other emerging countries are also very much engaged. The second area also to look will be the composition of trade. Is dominated by minerals and lubricants. So again, the precious stone, which account 60 to 90% total export, a pattern very similar in many ways. So the question is, the resource component becomes much more dominant. The concentration of this trade is also, we talk about Africa, but actually the trade is very much concentrated in a few countries. Most of them also mineral energy exporting countries. So here it must be clear that only a handful of African countries account for a large proportion of the region's export emerging economies. 5 of the largest ones, of course, is, as you see, Nigeria, Angola, Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, etc. So the overall picture you'll see is basically that natural resource is a driving. Much of the growth we're talking about the last 10 years is commodity, natural resource-driven growth, with very little diversification, although some countries that don't have strategic interest have done very well. The second part, probably to look into the investment decision. Here again, since 2000, FDI is growing by about $40 billion a year. The econometric projections from 2014 onward, we expect $75 to $100 billion coming into Africa. Much of this investment, again, has come from emerging economies. So you look at, in that picture, you hear about China, but look at Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, as increasingly contributing to a significant share of that investment. Considering past trend, resource-seeking investment will remain the dominant form of FDI to Africa, although there are signs of FDI also flowing into sectors such as construction, infrastructure, agriculture, and communication. My personal view, working on this issue, is that we really don't know how much is coming into Africa. We have absolutely no clue, and I can tell you that in many ways, but I'll come back to that point in a minute. For example, if you look into the actual volume of FDI to Africa from emerging economies, is very much underestimated by huge margin. For example, investment by private entities from emerging countries are most likely registered as FDI, whereas deals involving state-owned enterprises often involve a range of complex financing mechanisms and are not accounted as FDI. Export credits may be registered as aid, when in fact they might be financing particular sectors. The confusion, the data is absolutely confusing. We don't know much in that sense. Likewise, FDI to Africa is also continues to be unevenly distributed. As you can see in that figure, much of the FDI is going to oil, resource-rich African countries. So the red sign shows you that is basically countries that have oil and other natural resources. And the most interesting part to look at it also is really this next figure, which again shows you about, again, the focus is in minerals, mining. Finance is a very tricky number because maybe finance linked to mining and infrastructure figures. So the key area for me as I look into, I think I'm missing one figure I'm missing somehow that have to do with mergers and acquisitions. It is at an increase. Between 2006 and 2010, for example, mergers and acquisitions to Africa were about 30 billion. China, India, Brazil represented 3 out of the 5 merger acquisition data in 2010. So once again, the focus here, the resource seeking, has been the principal motivation by investors from emerging countries. Let me come back to the third dimension, which is aid. Reliable data on the volume and composition of aid from emerging countries, very hard to come by. Many southern partners do not disclose information on aid and other financial flows. They do not see themselves as giving aid to begin with. Second, it's difficult to differentiate export credit from concessional aid and resource for infrastructure deals. Some sources provide data on commitment and others on disbursement. Consequently, estimates on financial from emerging countries to Africa vary considerably. Despite these challenges, though, we can make about 3 important observations. First, unlike the traditional donors, emerging partners provide more support in the form of concessional rather than grant. Particularly, it also goes through the Export-Import Banks of China. The Export-Import Bank of India has been very, very critical. So in that area. Second, the large portion of aid is also in the form of technical assistance. They say all the rhetoric about, win-win situation, harmonious society, blah, blah. There is conditionality, non-policy conditions that have deals primarily with resource users. So in conclusion, what I can say is the success of emerging countries, particularly China and India, in winning access to Africa's resources is linked to an effective, well-coordinated government strategies that combines trade inducement, increased investment and flows, aid for infrastructure. So transforming this complex, this donor strategies is a condition for establishing a transparent legal institutional mechanism. So policy space is not given. The policy space is actually much more limited because the complexity how these things work. So certainly the AU process, the Africa mining visions, these are very important elements, but it is a complex world. For example, if you take 2010 from the Price Waterhouse, talks about return from mining companies grew by about 178%, while return to host government grew only by 60%, according to Price Waterhouse. Whether you call this reverse Robin Hood is another thing, but the reality is the ability to effectively bargain becomes a critical element. The question is, what is to be done? And many of this has been discussed about yesterday. How do you develop bargaining capacity? Effective bargaining capacity requires knowledge and information. In this regard, you can't negotiate if you don't have the ability for research and development. How do you have transparent system of awarding contract? I think somebody talked about yesterday. How to have strategic approach for benefication, diversification, industrialization. How to use collection of rent into national development. These are critical issues. Just to summarize, at present, as I say, the emerging partners are the main drivers in defining the nature and directions of this relationship. However, in order to make effective use of natural resources as springboard for diversification, industrialization, African states must take a very proactive role in defining the terms of condition of that relationship. It is imperative that African states exercise greater strategic control over their resources. So China, India, all know what they want from Africa. I'm not quite sure as Africans we know what we want from that relationship. Thank you.